Today's video is because I often get asked, should I have a disciplinary hearing? Or there are times that I've seen a disciplinary hearing unnecessarily be scheduled, or there are other times that I see where it was probably a good idea to schedule a hearing, but then a hearing wasn't conducted. So in today's video, I'm going to deep dive into the question, should you have a disciplinary hearing? But first, welcome back, or just welcome if you're new here. I'm Common Free. I'm an employment relations practitioner, and I'm also the director or owner of Free Employment Relations. I have included a list of my credentials in the description box below to give you some peace of mind around the content that I share. Relevant credential for this video is that I have chaired somewhere between 2,000 to 3,000 disciplinary hearings in my career, closer to 3,000 than to 2,000, and I still chair hearings pretty much every single week. Not part of my credentials, but good to know about me, is that I prioritize efficiency. I don't like wasting time or money, my own or anybody else's, so I'm not going to schedule a hearing or advocate for a hearing to be scheduled unless I think that there is value in doing so. Disclaimer for today's video is my usual disclaimer. I cover a lot of information in these videos, but I'm not able to cover every single exception to the rule or every single scenario. So therefore, these videos are for education and interest purposes only. Please schedule a consultation with a professional if you need to. Who is this video for, or who can potentially benefit from watching this video? This video is primarily for employers, and when I say employers, that includes anybody who represents an employer. So managers, team leaders, supervisors, HR, anybody who needs to make the decision of whether or not there should be a disciplinary inquiry on behalf of the employer, or anybody who is responsible for taking disciplinary action and therefore needs to make this decision. Of course, other practitioners or practitioners in training can potentially benefit from watching this video. And then employees, and again, when I say employees, using the term employee encompasses anybody who represents an employee as well. So that is employee representatives, or trade union representatives, or trade union officials, anybody representing an employee. This video is not primarily directed at employees, but I think the potential value for employees in watching today's video is that there are a lot of perceptions around when a hearing should or should not be scheduled. The information contained in today's video could potentially help an employee to have information about why your employer did not schedule a disciplinary hearing where you thought they should have scheduled one. Or it might give you enough information to feel that you would like to request a hearing from your employer where they chose not to schedule a disciplinary hearing. I do frequently get the comment or statement from employees that some or other disciplinary action is, in their opinion, unfair because there was no disciplinary inquiry prior to that. And that is not necessarily the case. Disciplinary action is not necessarily unfair if there wasn't a disciplinary hearing before that action was issued. That is not to say that nothing needs to happen. There needs to be something, and we're going to talk about that in today's video, but that something does not necessarily need to be a disciplinary hearing per se. For clarity, so that I don't add to the misperceptions that are out there, in today's video, when I say disciplinary hearing or disciplinary inquiry, what I mean is a formal disciplinary hearing, typically chaired by an external professional chairperson, someone like me, but also a very formal hearing chaired by potentially someone within your company. So to be clear, disciplinary hearing in today's video means formal disciplinary hearing. On to today's topic. Should you have a disciplinary hearing? For those who don't want all of the detail and those who don't necessarily want to watch the whole video, I'm going to provide a short description of a principle which should assist in guiding you to make the decision of whether or not you should have a disciplinary hearing. So the first thing we need to understand is that it is not necessary to have a formal disciplinary hearing every time there has been an offense that is committed or every single time disciplinary action is going to be issued. In some cases, and I will discuss them in this video, I believe that it can do more harm than good to have a formal disciplinary hearing. But that being said, You do have to do something before any action is taken. That is to say, before you issue any warning, or before you dismiss an employee or terminate the employment relationship, or before you make any changes, you need to provide an employee with a fair opportunity to state their case. You need to give them an opportunity to give their side or their version of the story. Hear them out. Not only is this a requirement for fairness, and I'm using the word fairness here to mean in accordance with the South African labor legislation, but also it is good practice. Why would you want to implement any changes or any disciplinary action without having sufficient information? Now, some might say that you don't need that information, or that any information is not going to make a difference to the outcome or to the action that you issued. And that may be true, but typically those are the minority of cases, and there is always a chance that you do not necessarily fully understand the scenario or fully understand all of the information or what happened. So maybe, just maybe, there's a tiny piece of the puzzle that impacts the action that is going to be taken. Another consideration that I would like to pose is, yeah, maybe the information will make no difference to the action that you take regarding this employee. Meaning you still choose to dismiss them, or you still choose to issue whatever warning you had in mind. I believe it's important for leaders to understand the counterproductive work behaviors that are taking place in your business. Counterproductive work behaviors are pretty much any behavior you don't want in your business, or behaviors that have a potentially negative impact on some element of your business. So while hearing the employee out may not make a direct difference to the action that you take towards that employee, I believe that it's still a good idea to understand the scenario better, to gather more information, to see if there are ways that you can mitigate this going forward or mitigate potential risks within your business, or ways that you could prevent this from happening again. One of the things that I focus on in my workshops is balancing the operational and the strategic. So balancing the day-to-day, daily decision-making and actions you need to take with the more long-term outlook, or the decisions that you need to make that potentially benefit on the longer term of the business. An easy way to do this with disciplinary matters is having some version of hearing out an employee before any disciplinary action is taken. So by hearing an employee out, you are meeting the operational needs, you are also meeting the requirements of the labor legislation, and potentially you're gathering information that may have an impact on your strategic decisions. This opportunity for an employee to state their case could be 5 minutes, and sometimes it could be 5 hours. It depends on the case. The 5-hour one, though, is more likely to be an incident or a scenario where it was probably a good idea to have a disciplinary inquiry, or the discussion is being had in such a way that it is not staying on track and on topic. So the short answer to should you have a disciplinary hearing, if you choose not to, at least ensure that you are giving an employee a fair opportunity to state their case. You are hearing their side of things. You are giving them an opportunity to hear their version. Let's get into more specifics now. First specific that I want to address is do not have a disciplinary hearing for anything other than alleged misconduct. Discipline is reserved for conduct issues. Conduct issues are commonly referred to as misconduct. This is only when employees break a rule in your company or disregard or break a standard in your company. In a future video, I will address how to determine or how to differentiate between capacity issues and conduct issues. But for today's video, if you have a charge or an allegation on your notice to attend a disciplinary inquiry that says something about poor work performance or not performing to the standard required of the business, or pretty much anything with the word performance in it, it means you are likely blurring the lines between conduct and capacity. And there's a high likelihood that the process that you follow may then be unfair. But not just unfair, it might also be ineffective for what you want to achieve, because you may be using the incorrect procedure for dealing with the issue that you have at hand. Disciplinary hearings are only for disciplinary matters. They are only for conduct matters, which is breaking the rules of the business. If you want examples of what constitutes as conduct, I have a guide that is for sale on my website. I think it has about 35 different offenses as well as my suggested approach to those offenses. Seeing those offenses might help you to determine whether something is a conduct issue or a capacity issue. There are many people who are not well versed in dealing with performance matters or who are uncomfortable with dealing with performance matters because it's not as clear-cut as disciplinary issues. So unfortunately, what sometimes happens is that people will try to squash a performance issue into a disciplinary process, but that isn't an appropriate way to go about it. In my workshops and in my coaching, I train managers and business leaders to effectively deal with performance. So this is one way in which you can become comfortable to deal with performance as a performance issue and not a disciplinary issue. If you are using the services of a professional or working with a professional who wants to make things easier by trying to force a performance issue into a disciplinary process, I would like to urge you to push back and to request that the appropriate procedure be used for whatever the issue is that you are dealing with. Or find a professional who is comfortable dealing with performance matters. And this isn't a personal thing. Professionals are better and more comfortable with different areas of the employment relationship. I know lots of employment relations practitioners who will openly say that they don't want to deal with performance matters. To conclude all of that, please do not try to squash a performance matter into a disciplinary procedure. Disciplinary hearings should be reserved for disciplinary matters. Moving on to the next point. Generally speaking, and as a general rule, disciplinary hearings should be scheduled if there's a possibility that the outcome of that hearing or the potential disciplinary action that is taken is going to be a dismissal. If there's a chance you're going to terminate the employment relationship as a result of what has occurred or what has potentially occurred, please schedule a disciplinary hearing. We shouldn't, in my opinion, take terminating the employment relationship lightly ever. So therefore, even if a case seems very clear-cut, even if it seems like there is going to be no information that is going to make a difference to the outcome, or there's nothing major to investigate, I still recommend having a disciplinary hearing because terminating the employment relationship should not be a light decision. Now, there is something that I'd like to discuss under that point because it frequently comes up. And that is the scenario where someone will say to me, oh, but the employee stole from me, so I don't need to have a disciplinary hearing. You still need to have a disciplinary hearing in cases of alleged dishonest conduct or alleged theft. Other times they may say to me, the person assaulted somebody, or the person entered in literally anything major and serious that you can think of. And then the person follows that up by saying, therefore they don't need to have a disciplinary hearing. You still need to give an employee a fair opportunity to state their case, even if what they did is incredibly serious. This came up in a workshop that I facilitated the other day, where managers expressed their doubts as to why should we have a disciplinary hearing when the person has done enter in X, Y, and Z that the managers believe is serious enough to justify not having a disciplinary hearing. And I'd like to share more or less what I responded in the workshop. Something to consider when we have that approach is that it isn't up to us to decide when something is serious enough to take away somebody's rights. The same way, we still have court cases for alleged crimes that are incredibly severe. Having a hearing or providing an employee with an opportunity to state their side is ensuring that you're complying with the labor legislation. You are also gathering information that could be valuable to you, and very importantly, you're still treating the person fairly and with respect. But a reminder is I am saying that you need to provide an employee an opportunity to state their case. That is to say, in some cases, you will schedule the hearing. That doesn't mean the hearing automatically takes place. That doesn't mean a hearing always has to happen before any action is taken. There are cases where the hearing won't take place. But from the employer side, and if you're representing the employer, that includes you too, is to attempt to provide that opportunity for an employee to state their case. There's many reasons why it wouldn't necessarily transpire that you do have the hearing. One of the most obvious ones is if an employee just chooses not to come to the hearing. There are times where you would have the hearing in the employee's absence, but that is a topic for another day. For this video, you will schedule the hearing and it will potentially take place or not. You will instigate the opportunity for an employee to state their case prior to disciplinary action being taken. I said at the beginning of this point is schedule a hearing if there is a likely possibility that the employment relationship is going to be terminated. So how do you know if there's a possibility that this scenario may result in a dismissal? You can use the guide that I spoke of that I've linked down below. That will show the different offenses, and it also has columns which will show that typically this type of offense you would go straight to maybe a dismissal or a final written warning or a dismissal, or this is a smaller offense whereby the following action may be more appropriate. But putting aside my guide, there are two scenarios that I'm going to discuss where there's a possibility that dismissal may be the outcome. We kind of already covered this one a little bit, but I'm gonna just go a bit deeper into it. Scenario number one is when the incident that has transpired is very serious enough for it to be dismissible. Dismissible means that you can be dismissed even if it is the first time that an employee has done this behavior. It does not mean that they are automatically dismissed, but it does mean that dismissal is a potential outcome or a potential consequence of this behavior. I have another video where I discuss things like automatic dismissals and summary dismissals, so I will link that down below for you. I'm not going to cover all of that information again in this video. Typically, dismissible offenses include things like dishonest conduct in the form of theft or fraud, pretty much any other type of dishonest conduct, physical assault, sexual harassment, and or endangering the life or lives of other people in the workplace. This is not an exhaustive list, those are just some examples, but as you can see, they are typically very serious offenses. Scenario number two, where dismissal is a possibility, is less serious offenses where corrective and progressive discipline has failed to have the desired impact. So these are things like unauthorized absenteeism, late coming, dereliction of duty, or negligence, where there have been previous warnings issued or there have been previous attempts at corrective measures, correcting the behavior, trying to bring about desired change, and those measures have been unsuccessful in bringing about the desired change. So typically here, if you're going to be scheduling a hearing, the assumption would be that the employee has a valid final written warning for the same or similar offense that they are now being charged with. So basically, progressive and corrective discipline has been implemented, but then that same or similar behavior has continued once or more than once after the employee was given their final opportunity to correct that behavior. On that note, let me get to the next point, which is, should you have a disciplinary hearing where the likely outcome is going to be a final written warning? And the answer is sometimes. Under this point, I'm going to provide some guides, some principles, some tips that could be helpful for you to decide whether or not you want to schedule a formal hearing where the likely outcome might be a final written warning. These guides can be applied to the wider context of just making a general decision about whether or not you should be having a disciplinary hearing. When else to have a disciplinary hearing? Also under this section, I'm going to be discussing things that might help you decide whether or not it is a good idea to get a professional person, someone like me or any other employment relations practitioner, to chair the hearing rather than having somebody within your company do it. In the same way that I don't necessarily advocate for having disciplinary hearings all the time, I don't think that it is necessary to have a professional chairperson handle every single alleged offense in your business. So some of these points might help you decide when you want to use the services of a professional, or when you feel comfortable that somebody within your business can do it. So first point under when else to have a disciplinary hearing is when what has occurred is very messy and complicated. If the case has a lot of information, if the case has contradictory information, if the case has potential witnesses that it's not so easy to understand exactly what transpired, various witness accounts don't line up, or there's potentially a lot of gray area around the potential alleged offense that occurred, or it's got a lot of elements where you're not really sure what type of offense you would classify this as, because there's just a lot of complexities, a lot of information, a lot of generally gray areas, and it's just not a clear-cut case. Then it might be a good idea to schedule a hearing. And why is that? The chairperson most likely has a lot of experience with dealing with messy and complicated cases. We are typically very good at knowing what information is relevant. We're typically very good at making sense of a whole lot of contradictory information and to elicit the information in a structured way and generally conduct the procedure in an efficient way to obtain the important information. Part of a chairperson's job, in my opinion, is to conduct a hearing in an effective and an efficient way. If you have a messy case, my recommendation would be pick a chairperson who's done a lot of hearings before, who has a lot of experience with hearings, and you have a higher likelihood of them ensuring that it is dealt with in an efficient way and that the important information is elicited to make an appropriate decision. Second point is when should you have a disciplinary hearing is maybe when you don't know whether this thing that has transpired is a conduct issue or a capacity issue. So if you can't determine upfront whether what you're dealing with is a conduct issue or a capacity issue, it might be a good idea to get a professional chairperson in who, as part of the procedure that they conduct, gathers the relevant information to decide whether it is a conduct issue or a capacity issue and makes a formal decision on whether it's a conduct issue or a capacity issue. And if they find that it is a capacity issue, to then change the procedure to appropriately deal with that. And if it's a conduct issue, to proceed with the disciplinary hearing. Capacity here, because earlier in the video I spoke about only performance, capacity here includes other types of incapacity in addition to performance. So things like alcoholism or other drug addictions, or anything that is an employee from being unable to fulfill the role or unable to meet the requirements of the job. Point number 3 of when it might be a good idea to have a disciplinary hearing is when the scenario that you're dealing with is uncomfortable. Sometimes things that happen in the workplace are very uncomfortable and awkward for managers and leaders to deal with. This can be a variety of things, but I do not recommend pushing a manager or a leader to deal with a scenario where they feel uncomfortable by that scenario, because it's likely that their discomfort is going to influence the procedure. And just remember that it is not a bad thing for a leader to voice that they are uncomfortable and probably not the best person to be dealing with something. In my opinion, it would be a good leadership quality to rather be open and upfront ahead of time to say, I don't think that I have the capacity, or I don't think that it would be a good idea for me to deal with this particular scenario, rather get somebody else to do it who would potentially be a better fit to deal with it. There are lots of ways that you can determine whether an issue falls into what I'm talking about now. One of the easiest ways is if you cannot get through it without giggling, then probably you're not the right person for it. So essentially, if you cannot maintain professionalism throughout, then maybe you are not the best person to be dealing with it. Another way this point can play out is when someone is not able to put aside their moralistic judgments. What I mean here is when whatever has occurred or the alleged offense is very much contrary to the person's belief or contrary to a sort of moral standing that they hold, and that then impacts their ability to conduct the procedure in a professional and an impartial way, as well as conducting it in an empathic way. So basically, if you're going to be judging the person as a bad person rather than focusing purely on their behavior. Or if you're going to continuously use language that implies judgment about the person, so your language is literally saying things about who they are as a human being, rather than just speaking about the behavior or the incident that occurred, then maybe you are not the best person to be handling this particular scenario. In another video, I can discuss how to refrain from using language that implies that you're making judgments about a person and rather focusing on the behavior of the person. I'm not going to deep dive into that in this video, but I do think that if you recognize that you are unable to purely focus on the behavior, then you may not be the best person to deal with the issue at hand. Another one under this point is if whatever has occurred feels somehow personal to you. Maybe the incident that occurred is close to home, maybe it brings up something for you, maybe it somehow touches on something that is still a very raw or sensitive thing for you. This will likely impact your ability to stay focused on the person and to provide them their fair opportunity to state their case. And it's likely that your judgment might be a little bit clouded with your own experiences or your own feelings about something rather than purely staying focused on what occurred with the employee. Again, in my opinion, it is a good quality to know and to express when we recognize that we are unable to be impartial or likely to not be able to be impartial when dealing with a particular scenario. Okay, another scenario where you might want to have a disciplinary hearing is when there are stakeholders involved or people involved who would like some kind of evidence or report to show that the incident or the alleged incident was dealt with in a formal manner. So sometimes in the workplace, there are other stakeholders involved in an incident, and they might want some feedback on how the issue was dealt with. One of the most common examples that I can think of that I've been asked to chair a hearing is when there are children involved. Oftentimes parents will want to know that there was a formal disciplinary hearing, that the matter was taken very seriously, and sometimes they might want a report or some kind of feedback from the chairperson. There might be other scenarios where it is a supplier or a customer or the media or the community or any other party that somehow is impacted by the procedure or the outcome of the hearing. I will say here is my recommendation is to be tactful when making this particular decision and to balance the needs of the stakeholder or the request from the stakeholder, as well as ensuring that we maintain respect and fairness for the employee. So I'm not saying every single time another person or a group of people request that you have a formal hearing that you should have a hearing, or that they request some kind of report or outcome that you should provide that. I'm saying it is a consideration, and then weigh up the needs of this stakeholder, and also can you maintain respect and fairness to the employee while still meeting the needs of this stakeholder. All right, next one, when to have a disciplinary hearing. When you want to convey the severity or the seriousness in an attempt to bring about desired behavioral changes. So sometimes it might be valuable to have a disciplinary hearing where the likely outcome is going to be a final written warning, because you'd like to use this hearing as an opportunity to convey the severity or the seriousness and the strong desire to bring about a specific change in behavior. I am not one for fear tactics. I'm not saying use a disciplinary hearing as a fear tactic. What I mean here is that a more formal procedure might be helpful in conveying the message that something needs to be taken seriously. Sometimes managers feel like they have tried and tried and tried, and they've tried everything, but the behavior is not changing, and they really don't want to get to the stage of terminating the employment relationship, but they also need the behavior to change. Sometimes in those cases, it might be a good idea to schedule a hearing before termination is a likely outcome, where other corrective measures are still a possibility to be implemented, in the hopes that maybe having somebody else or having a formal procedure might bring about the desired change. Next point at when to have a disciplinary hearing is if the employee is a shop steward or a trade union representative. Sometimes, based off of discussions with the trade union, it might be best to have a more formal procedure if the employee is a shop steward or trade union representative. But in the case where you have a recognized trade union representative, you're likely to consult the trade union after there has been an incident, and based on the consultation with the trade union, you will decide whether to proceed with having a disciplinary hearing or not. Now moving on to the final section of today's video. When not to have a disciplinary hearing. There are times where I do not recommend that you go through a formal hearing process. But you will remember that I said this many times in this video. That is not to say you forego giving an employee a fair opportunity to state their case. You still give them a fair opportunity to state their case. You're just not going to necessarily do a formal hearing. This section is when do I believe it is maybe not a good idea to have a formal disciplinary hearing. Number one, when it is a first time, straightforward, minor offense that has occurred. Typically, the best person to be dealing with this is the direct leader. The direct manager, supervisor, team leader, whoever is directly responsible for the employee is typically the best person to deal with this. In my opinion, it would be a waste of resources and also typically ineffective to have a formal hearing for something like an employee coming late to work for the first time ever, and they were only like 15 or 20 minutes late. A discussion from the direct leader in that case is what I would typically recommend. Number two, when not to have a hearing. If you're going to use that hearing as a fear tactic, please do not use hearings to threaten people or to somehow scare them. We convey potential consequences to behavior and we convey severity, but we don't threaten people. I probably need to do a bit of a more deep dive into demonstrating exactly how this point differs from what I said earlier and how we can use a hearing to convey severity and potentially bring about a change in the behavior, but not use it as a fear tactic, not use it as a threat or to scare employees into making changes, because those are different things. Point number three of when not to have a hearing is when your reason for having that hearing is for a leader to avoid responsibility. This is something I see very often. It is where leaders, team leaders, supervisors, managers, whoever abdicates responsibility of correcting behavior to HR or to a chairperson or to a hearing. Typically, they do this because they want to only deal with the more positive things. I think it is very important for us to question our own motives and to question why we make certain decisions. And I urge leaders to question themselves when they schedule a hearing. Are you scheduling that hearing because you think that it is the best thing for the employee and for the incident that has occurred? Or are you scheduling that hearing because you don't want to deal with it and you feel uncomfortable by dealing with it? But the point I'm making is if you lack the skills, invest in those skills or find a way to invest in those skills, because oftentimes the best person, the most effective person to deal with some of these cases is the direct leader of the employee. So even if a matter is handled by somebody more senior or by HR or by an employment relations practitioner, or there is a formal hearing, I typically request that the person's direct leader be present in those procedures and in those discussions so that they are a part of the decision making, even if it's going to be dealt with primarily by somebody else. So to conclude, the point that I was making here is please do not schedule a hearing to avoid the task of leading, which includes attempts at corrective measures and addressing counterproductive work behaviors. And that is where I'm going to end off today's video. I hope that this video was helpful for you. Let me know in the comments below what other content you want to see or what other questions you want me to answer in these videos. Remember that my website has a lot of resources and I will be updating it as I go along. So if there's something missing that you would like, let me know what you need, but you can also schedule a consultation with me if what you're looking for is not on my website or not yet covered in one of my videos. If you found value in this video, please remember that it is helpful for me if you like and subscribe, comment, watch the video, share it with other people, and all of those other things.